Hey everyone, welcome. Happy to have you guys here. If you're joining us, let me know that you're here by clicking the little like or love if you really want to love it. I am so excited to be able to do another one of these Facebook Lives with you guys. Let me know that you're here in the comments or through your likes or your loves. So today is going to be kind of like a free training session. There's going to be lots of good info about a cultural approach to disability integration. And I can tailor it to your needs. Drop questions in the comments and I will do my best to answer them throughout or maybe by the end. But I really want this to be, like, I have some information that I want to give you, but I also want this to be pertinent to your specific context and where you're at. So, like, for example, if you're a parent who happens to be watching this, share this with the people at your parish. Share this with other parents who can share this with people at their church. Ask questions. Yeah, I love that Facebook allows me to bring this to you for free. Because I think it's a great way to kind of get this information and message out. Yeah, so it's going to be a really good chat today. And it will be made even better by your questions. The other thing is that, normally I do these trainings face-to-face. And one of the things I like about face-to-face is that I can look at the people I'm speaking with to see their reactions and to get their questions. And that helps me gauge, like, okay, I may think something super interesting and kind of go on and on, but you might be like, nah, I don't really need that. So one of the things you can do to help me with this, especially if you're watching this live, is give me likes or loves, things like that, as we go throughout the video, so that I know that what I'm saying is something that you're actually interested in. And if I'm not seeing too many likes or loves and I know you're here, then I will kind of move on to something else. So don't be afraid to ask your questions. I have my little question taking thing over here. So, you can also go to uniquelycatholic.org. This live video is based on a post that I did this week about moving from a deficit mentality to a cultural mentality. And so there's some information on that blog post. There's a list of resources. Today we're going to go a little bit more in depth. And like I said, if you're here and asking questions, it'll kind of personalize it. If you're watching this in the replay, still feel free to ask questions or leave comments, because I'll come back and I can answer questions after the fact, or reply to your comments or whatnot. The other thing is that I want to let you know that we have we send out a monthly at most email. And why I say monthly at most is because usually it's like a recap of, like, hey, here are some highlights in case you missed them, and some upcoming, things going on. Like, maybe you didn't know that we had a Facebook Live coming up today. So you can sign up for our monthly at most emails on, I believe, our website, uniquelycatholic.org. You can also shoot us an email. It's uniquelycatholic.org@gmail.com. I know somebody already had uniquelycatholic@gmail.com, so I don't know, hopefully they join us on our page or the Facebook Live, but uniquelycatholic.org@gmail.com. That is our email. And if you haven't already, like us on Facebook. This week we're focusing a lot on, because we're really focusing on the cultural aspect of disability integration. We're posting lots of videos and articles from other sources that really help with developing our cultural understanding. We do that all the time, but we're doing more posts this week, just to kind of amp up this whole process and support this whole process. So if you're just joining us today, we're talking about how we go to a cultural approach for disability integration. So we're going to talk about what that means, what the alternative is. We're going to talk about how to do that, why it matters, etc. And like I said, if what we're saying is helpful or interesting, give us the likes, the loves throughout the video. Facebook Live's interesting. Usually you see a post on Facebook and you just go, oh, I like it, and you click it once. But with these videos, the likes, the loves, hopefully you don't have sad faces or angry faces, but the reactions are, you just keep doing it through real time. It's meant to be like a feedback system, rather than a one-time, cool, I liked it. So please feel free to keep doing that. Okay, so let's, and like I said, at any point, enter your questions in the comments. I'll be happy to answer them. So let's talk about disability integration. We tend to approach disability integration in a certain way. So oftentimes when I hear people like catechists or DREs or priests, etc., youth ministers maybe, talk about like disability integration, they're like, oh my gosh, I'm having this problem. Or how do I do a Bible study with somebody who doesn't engage? Or how am I supposed to give a guided meditation to somebody who is blind? Or how do I get somebody to pay attention to our talks when they're bouncing off the walls, etc., right? So it's always like a problem or like a challenge, or we're focusing on a deficit, like what the individual can't do, or what they're not doing right. Now it's okay to troubleshoot. It's okay to sometimes go, I've been leading this Bible study and this person just doesn't seem to really engage in what we're doing. So what can I do differently? Like, it's okay to do that. But that can't be our mindset going into disability integration. We call that a deficit mindset. Number one, it treats a person like the sum of their behaviors. So rather than looking at an individual, what you're seeing first is not the person in your Bible study or sitting at Mass or in your faith formation class or whatever the setting is. You're looking at a problem. So it's treating a person like a problem. And this is also how we get checklists. So you'll see a lot of like disability ministry resources that'll say, well, if this is the problem that you're experiencing, or if this is the challenging behavior, or if this is the struggle that you're experiencing, then try this, this, or this. And we get these checklists. And don't get me wrong, having a game plan is absolutely like valuable and important. One of the best practices you might have is having like what we call an individual faith formation plan. So being able to say like, okay, this is the needs of the individual and this is how we meet them. Like, having that game plan is super important. But we have to recognize that these plans, these checklists, are just tools. They can't be, the sole focus of our relationship and our interactions with these individuals in our parish, with our parishioners with disabilities. Because if that's all you're doing, right, if all you're doing is using these checklists, right, well, okay, this student is in my faith formation class, my confirmation class, and they're not, maybe they're not listening when I gave these directions, so my checklist says to go stand next to them and give the direction again, right? Well, if you don't understand your student, right? Yes, maybe they didn't hear you because they can't filter out all the background noise. It's a sensory processing issue. Or maybe it is like an executive functioning issue and they need you to repeat the directive or question again. But if they're not responding because maybe they're anxious and so they're shutting down, or they're overwhelmed on sensory overload and shutting down, going and standing next to them could be physically intimidating, and that's not going to help you. So that's where we need to make this switch to a cultural mindset. And really what we're talking about when we talk about a cultural mindset is that we're seeing the person and their experience within their disability first, rather than seeing them as the sum of their behaviors or addressing them as a checklist or a problem. We're trying to understand and appreciate the individual in their context with disability. And it meets them where they're at. So, again, let's say you have that student who's not responding, right? If you take the time to get to know them, to understand how their disability does or doesn't impact them, maybe they have executive functioning challenges. And so you know that you need to just kind of get a little bit closer to them, meet them at eye level and say, repeat the directive again. Hey, can you do this? Maybe when you get to know your student, you understand that if they're not responding, they're more in like a shutdown mode. They might be anxious. And so you don't push it. You just kind of let them, keep doing what they need to do, because whatever they're doing is soothing and calming and helping them cope, right? And this is the other key thing, is that taking a cultural approach to disability integration, it's relational, so when you're trying to understand the adult in your Bible study who has a disability, you're not trying to dissect them, like let me understand them and study them like a biology experiment or something like that. You're really just trying to get to know them as a person. And when you approach disability integration as a culture, like a cultural perspective, you're really recognizing that disability is just another way of being human, right? You're not, again, because you're not dissecting them, you're not treating them like some three-headed alien or like a puzzle that you have to solve or figure out. You recognize that disability is a part of their unique experience of life and of faith. And so that's where you're meeting them at. And again, if anything I'm saying is helpful or resonating with you or interesting, give me those likes or those loves so that I know that I'm on the right track with you as we keep going along. And so really we can summarize it as this. When we have a cultural approach to disability integration, we're building empathy and understanding and acceptance, and even more than that, we're building appreciation of the individual, and particularly in their disability context. So I gave you an example, right? So of like the student in confirmation class. Let me give you another example. Okay, let's say a person isn't paying attention or engaging in the Bible study, and you may ask the question like, well, why aren't they engaged? What can I do to get them engaged? Instead, you might ask, what is happening in the environment that could be distracting or overwhelming? What structure or ways of interacting might be overwhelming or inducing anxiety? How can we take this week's topic or scripture passage and relate it to something that this person is interested in? Especially some people with developmental disabilities might have restricted interests, right? All of us have our passions and our hobbies and our things that really click with us, right? So this is no different than anything else we would do. If you think about like in youth ministry, like if you're using examples and trying to make a topic relatable, you're going to relate it to something that is actually an experience and interesting to the teens, right? So this is no different, okay? Another example, let's say you are a liturgy coordinator or a pastor, even a dearie, or just a regular parishioner, okay? And you see an individual with sensory processing disorder, perhaps on the autism spectrum, and they're stimming at Mass. And, stimming, if you don't know, is self-stimulatory behavior. So it can be repetitive motions, it can be using certain objects to fidget. It could be vocal stimming, like humming or saying a phrase over and over. And stimming is often like a coping tool. It's a soothing tool. It can make a person feel better if they are overwhelmed, if they're anxious. It can also be something to help focus their senses so that they can block out some of the overwhelming senses. And so if you're coming from this deficit mentality, or the way that we often will approach maybe stimming at Mass would be like, well, I see this person stimming. How do I get them to stop? Okay, taking a cultural perspective though, instead you would understand, okay, stimming isn't bad. Stimming is comforting. It's a coping mechanism for the person. We're just going to let them stim. However, we also want to ask, like, are they stimming because they are overwhelmed, anxious, uncomfortable? And if so, is there something that we can do to make them less overwhelmed, less anxious, or more comfortable? And it's not because we want to get them to stop stimming because it's distracting or abnormal or whatever, right? More just because we want them to feel more at ease and comfortable and like they belong. And so those are kind of some examples of kind of making that switch from a deficit mentality to a cultural mentality. And it can be very subtle, but it really is like the foundation necessary to be able to engage disability integration. And again, if you guys have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments, or if you have any comments, maybe your own experience that you want to share, please feel free to leave them in the comments. Now, here's a key fact about having a cultural approach, okay? So far, we've been talking a lot about having a cultural mindset to be able to figure out the best accommodations and where to meet people at in a certain situation to help them feel comfortable and ease and whatnot. But it's not just about figuring out accommodations when we have that cultural approach, right? It also can enrich our own experience of faith. And it also helps us to be aware, particularly in like a faith formation context, or like for priests, when you're preaching your homilies, that what we're talking about in our faith, what we're trying to hand on in our faith, that individuals with disabilities, right, they have a very unique experience of the world. Okay, and a lot of times what our world tells them is you have to change or do this or that. You have to fit in. And once you fit in, at least to a certain level, then we will go ahead and accept you. Then you can be a part of us. And so if you could imagine, like, let's say you're talking about being made in God's image and likeness. That can be really powerful for someone who has felt the weight of a society saying that you have to change who you are in order to fit in or to be a part of us, right? To be accepted. To know that somebody is made in God, like with a disability, is made in God's image and likeness, like that can be really healing for them and really powerful. And they can also help to teach us if we have this cultural approach, right? Because the cultural approach is all about learning and understanding. That can help teach us, what does it mean to be made in God's image and likeness? Like, I may have one idea, right, from my own context. You may have your own idea from like a non-disabled person's context, but what does that mean to have a disability and to be on the margins within our society and know that you are made in God's image and likeness? So another example, right? If we're talking about Jesus dying on the cross for us while we are still sinners, while we are still broken, while we are still messes, like that's powerful to us. But imagine like the beautiful conversation that could happen if a person, has felt rejection because of their disability, and has felt unloved because of their disability. Or another really big one is if we're talking about, for example, Jesus' glorified body after the resurrection, and how Jesus' glorified form still contained the scars, the marks of his crucifixion, right? What does that say to us about what it means to be perfect and holy? And, our society will often say things about like, what the perfect look is and physicality is. But Jesus often, he tells us something different, and he shows us something different. So it's not just about accommodations. It's even about like enriching how we understand faith and how we share the faith with others. So hopefully, that helps you kind of, get some ideas of what cultural integration is and why it's important, how critical it is as a foundation. And again, if what I'm saying is something that's resonating with you, or interesting, give me those likes or loves, give me some reactions, let me know that you're here. So now I want to share with you some sources. Okay, now that we've talked about what is a cultural approach, why is a cultural approach important for disability integration, let's talk about some sources. So the first source for learning, knowing, and understanding are the individuals with the disability themselves, and the local communities who are within your parish already. So if you want to understand autism, you want to understand cerebral palsy, you want to understand Down syndrome, go spend time with your parishioners who are on the autism spectrum, who have cerebral palsy, who have Down syndrome. Go spend time with individuals in those local communities. You want to understand the deaf community, go on meetup.com and find a local deaf community that doesn't mind hearing people coming and learning from them at their meetups. Second to that is loved ones. Now, if you're talking about a child with a disability, this is probably going to be like parents and siblings. But remember that, especially when we're talking about like developmental disabilities or learning disabilities or intellectual disabilities, right? Physical disabilities, regardless, a disabled child will grow up to be a disabled adult. So when we're thinking about loved ones, you also have to think about significant others, spouses, and even children. The loved ones of an individual with a disability are a great secondary resource because their experience of life is also intimately intertwined with their loved one with the disability. However, because they don't have actually experienced the disability, potentially, right? Maybe you have a child in your faith formation who's on the autism spectrum and one of their parents is also on the autism spectrum. But if they don't have a disability, it's not going to be exactly the same. And this kind of makes sense no matter what. Like, if you want to know me as a person, you're going to come to me first. You could talk to my husband, you could talk to my son, and they'll probably give you some ideas, but it's not going to be the same accuracy or intimacy or complete full picture of who I am unless you come to me, right? And the same goes, like if I want to get to know you, right? Who's the best person to go to? It's you. You understand yourself best. So that is why loved ones are secondary. Third would be self-advocates and organizations that work with actually disabled individuals. So these would be people from the disability community who are, maybe not local, but who are sharing their own experience and educating. And again, this is probably going to be a broader and more generalized knowledge. And so we have to be careful with that knowledge. There's a saying in the autism community that I think is true across the board. If you know one person with autism, you know one person with autism. There are some general experiences. That's what culture is, like shared experiences. But every individual is going to be different. So just because you are reading a blog by, an individual who struggles with executive functioning, as part of their experience of autism, doesn't mean that the person in your Bible study who's on the autism spectrum will also struggle with executive functioning. However, again, they are the ones who are actually experiencing the disability. They are going to be another great resource. And again, if you have any questions or thoughts, please feel free to leave them in the comments. Give me some likes or loves. Let me know that you're here, if what I'm saying is resonating or helpful. So the fourth source for developing this cultural understanding, increasing our cultural knowledge, are professionals. They can be a good source for even more general information. But it's very important to recognize that not all professionals actually understand the culture of the disability community they're writing or talking about. Some professionals know their profession very well, but they don't necessarily know the community they're supporting well. They might not kind of get it, so to speak, right? And if you are well informed by the people in your life from the disability community, the self-advocates in general, you're going to better be able to spot the professionals who get it, and who you can really kind of rely on a little bit more than those who really only get their profession. So to give you some examples of like professionals and even like family members, loved ones getting it wrong, I'm going to focus on two examples from the autism community. So one of the common myths with autism is that people on the autism spectrum tend to not feel empathy. They struggle with empathizing. And as more individuals on the autism spectrum began to share their experiences, they said, that really doesn't resonate. And really what my experience is like is that I feel empathy so strongly that sometimes I shut down. I don't even know what to say or do because I'm feeling what this other person is feeling so strongly. So it's like kind of the exact opposite of this commonly held myth about autism of like, well, autistic people, don't feel empathy. And a lot of the research recently has been kind of backing that up. So for example, with the use of functional MRIs, scientists are finding that, a lot of people on the autism spectrum, the amygdala part of their brain, which is really kind of what drives emotions, it tends to be larger, physically larger, in people on the spectrum than on the autism spectrum than neurotypical people who are not on the autism spectrum. Another study found that there tends to be more neural pathways and connections in the amygdala. So that would make sense, is that if you have this larger, more connected part of your brain that operates and really functions with your emotions, it kind of backs up this idea that people on the autism spectrum are experiencing their emotion, empathizing so intensely that they may shut down and not know what to do, and that's why they may come across as unempathetic. And then another research study found that there's actually a separate condition called alexithymia that contributes to not being able to recognize or understand emotions in yourself and possibly others. And one of the studies that I read found that only 50% of people on the autism spectrum were found to have alexithymia, and the study found that even individuals not on the autism spectrum had alexithymia. So that might be a contributing factor to not being able to empathize or struggling with empathy, but it's something that affects individuals regardless of whether they are neurodivergent or on the autism spectrum, or whether they're neurotypical, not on the autism spectrum, or having other neurological differences. Again, that's where, not all professionals and families kind of understood that. And even still, it's a myth that tends to still exist about autism. The second one is about individuals that we call nonverbal on the spectrum. So they cannot speak the way that we do. They communicate in other ways. And so for a lot of kids who were, not considered nonverbal, parents and professionals would just talk about them in front of them, and it was assumed that they weren't mentally competent, or they didn't understand or care, or weren't registering the conversations going on around them. And with the development of assistive and augmentative communication devices like PECS, the Picture Exchange Communication System, or with using the iPad and some of the apps that allow and help with communication, what we've been finding from these individuals who are considered nonverbal is that they've been listening the whole time, and they've been hearing and understanding everything, and that they are mentally competent, and that they have things that they want to say, and that they have been trying with their bodies, their voices or whatnot, to communicate however they can, however their body allows them to. And now with like typing, or like I said, these apps, or the Picture Exchange Communication System, we're finding out that there's a lot more going on. So just two examples that are remarkable stories are Dylan Barmash, and I'll put some links after the Facebook live feed for you to check out. Dylan Barmash is a young man who uses his iPad to communicate now, and he's very articulate about, like, we need to listen to individuals with the disability. You need to listen to nonverbal people. And then Carly Fleischman. She's probably a little bit more well known. I think like 2020 or like Dateline or something did stories about her. She now, from her Facebook page, she's kind of starting her own online talk show. She's interviewed a few like famous people already, like actors and stuff. And she's hilarious. So I would definitely check them out. And she's nonverbal, so she uses like a computer or iPad to communicate as well. So on the blog post this week, so those are just two examples. First, those are just two examples of to reinforce this idea that primary, we go to the individual with the disability to understand. Secondary would be loved ones. Third would be, and this is like a close, like second and third are really close, right? Would be disability advocates, from like the broader community, and then fourth would be professionals. So some on the blog post this week about shifting from a deficit mentality to a cultural mentality, I gave a list with links to books, organizations, websites, podcasts, and individuals that are good. They're just a starting point, just a jumping off point. I would really recommend kind of following up, and searching even more. But so for example, the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, they tend to do a lot of more kind of like legal, political, ensuring rights, but it's a great way to find individual advocates to be able to listen to their stories and understand their experiences. The National Association of the Deaf, the National Down Syndrome Society, other great resources. A resource that I really like, they have a Facebook page, they have a website, and they also have a podcast. It's called Tilt Parenting. And they really take the neurodiversity approach. So rather than like it's a deficit, ADHD, autism, their problems, their challenges, their deficits. They take the neurodiversity approach, meaning that there are great things about being on the autism spectrum, about having ADHD or being dyslexic or having dyspraxia, etc., and that there are strengths that we need to celebrate as well. And so they have a mix of professionals. One of the moms, I think, who runs Tilt Parenting, she'll have her son Asher on the podcast. They'll have conversations. One of their most recent podcasts, I think, was that listeners could ask Asher questions. And I believe Asher's on the autism spectrum. A great resource for disability integration, particularly with the deaf community, but also even the blind and visually impaired community, is AI Media. They have a website, and their blog is chock full of some great information. They also have a Facebook page, and they post great videos. I've shared some of their videos this week on the Uniquely Catholic page, and I'll continue to do so. So definitely check them out. The National Catholic Partnership on Disability has some good resources. They do work in terms of meeting with dioceses and some of the bishops. They were recently at the Vatican for a disability conference, and they have some, like task forces, some committees on particular disabilities. Some of their links go to things like universal design, which is great for physical space. You can also look up universal design for learning, for faith formation setting. Obviously, like I post stuff on my website, the uniquelycatholic.org website, on our Facebook page, to try and help with disability understanding, cultural understanding of disability. TheMighty.com. You've probably seen The Mighty on Facebook or heard of The Mighty, but go subscribe to them. They have a lot of loved ones who will post their personal experiences, but they also have individuals from the disability communities themselves who will share like a particular experience or stories. And that's a great way of kind of also understanding like, oh, I never would have thought about like, how does a person who is blind or visually impaired access our parish website, especially if it's a very graphic intensive website? Are we using descriptive text and like tags in the within the HTML coding so that a special reader program will describe the image to the individual who is blind or visually impaired, etc. Neurodivergent Rebel, she has a blog. She also does a lot of tweeting. So if you're on Twitter, I'd go find Neurodivergent Rebel. She's a young woman on the autism spectrum, and she will post questions, and she gets a lot of great feedback from like the autism community about like, oh yeah, anybody else struggle with driving at night because of the lights and sensory processing, or how do you handle this or that in your life? So she has some really great threads, and I feel like she uses Twitter really well, but she also blogs. So look up Neurodivergent Rebel. The Cerebral Palsy Foundation is a great resource for cerebral palsy. I know they team up also with a hilarious disability advocate, Zach Anner. He's actually like a comedian, and he's funny, and he creates some excellent videos. Like one of my favorite videos that he did was that he went to New York and was in search of like this particular special like rainbow bagel. Now I have to warn you, the language is not safe for work per se, but it really shows you like all the things that somebody who's not in a wheelchair takes for granted in terms of being able to get around and accessibility, and something that would take you or I like 15 minutes to go run this errand ends up taking him like all day to do. And even then when he gets to the shop, there's like a step and he can't get in. So sorry, spoiler alert, I gave it away, but it's a great video, and he highlights these great issues, and he does it with humor, so it's really accessible, pun not intended, to watch. One of my all-time favorite resources for developing cultural understanding is Special Books by Special Kids, SBSK. And they have a website, but they also are on Facebook, and they have a YouTube channel. And literally all they do, Chris Ulmer is one of the creators, and his girlfriend Alyssa, and literally all they do is travel the country and even the world sometimes. And they do interviews with people with various diagnoses. And they really just ask, like, what's your perspective? What is life like for you? What do you want people to know about you? How should people approach you? It's really, really beautiful. So I really, really, if there's only one resource that you take away from this, I would say go like Special Books by Special Kids. Go follow them. SBSK. ThinkInclusive.us is a great resource, especially for translating to like faith formation, or Bible study, adult faith formation, children's faith formation. Think Inclusive is all about inclusive education, and they're thinking more about like classroom settings, like public school, private school, but we can translate a lot of those best practices into our faith formation for children and adults. Similar to that is the National Catholic Board on Full Inclusion. It is specifically about advocating for and supporting Catholic schools becoming more inclusive of individuals with disabilities. So they have some great resources as well that we can pull over into the parish side. Or if you're coming from a Catholic school, like definitely go to their website, the National Catholic Board on Full Inclusion. Another resource that I've recently come across is NOS Magazine, and it's a news and commentary source for thought and analysis about neurodiversity, news, culture, and representation. So, like, for example, the Netflix series Atypical. I looked through the web, I watched it myself, and I gave some feedback about if you're watching Atypical and thinking like, oh, I'm going to understand autism better, this is what you need to know. NOS Magazine is very new, but they do, for the most part, like a weekly episode guide, for example, with the new show, The Good Doctor. And they give you kind of their feedback as a person who's on the autism spectrum about like, well, this was great, this was not so great, here's what they got right, here's what was a little off, etc. Plus they post all kinds of different articles and videos, other resources to help with, again, that cultural understanding from the perspective of an individual with a disability. And again, guys, if you have any questions or, like what is being said here, like give me some likes or loves. Let me know that you find this interesting or helpful. Questions, leave me comments. So specifically for sacramental prep and faith formation, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops recently revised their guidelines for the celebration of the sacraments with persons with disabilities. I believe it was published in June of this year. So go read that because it is amazing. Since 1978, the U.S. bishops have been really talking about disability integration, about this a cultural approach, even if that's not the language that they're using, but really the sense of presuming competence and ensuring that we're not excluding people even by passive omission. Right? So like when we confess, right, it's not only the sins that we commit, but the things that we fail to do that we should be doing. And so it's this idea of like, not only are we, what are we doing for disability integration, but also like, are we being aware of like what we're failing to do? And are we using excuses? And how do we understand and help individuals to be able to celebrate the sacraments? So it's a really, really good and necessary resource. One of the resources that I used for my thesis that is the foundation for what we do with Uniquely Catholic is the USCCB, so the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, their book resource called Best Practices for Shared Parishes. It's all about ecclesial integration. So that is a great resource if you're able to understand and translate it into a disability context. A fantastic book for understanding autism culturally a little bit better is The Reason I Jump by Naoki Higashida. And he also just released another book that I think is called Fall Down 7 Times, Get Up 8, or something along those lines. And he is he's a nonverbal autistic young man who, it's like people ask questions and he like responds. So it's like question answer kind of dialogue in his book, and it's really, really good. The Autistic Brain by Temple Grandin. She herself is an autistic woman, and she's probably one of the most famous autistic advocates out there, and she's written a ton of books. The Autistic Brain specifically addresses like a more scientific approach to understanding autism. Like that's where I got some of my information, for example, about the functional MRIs. A really, really fantastic book for I think just this approach of like approaching people as like human beings first, and having this cultural understanding when you are building a relationship with an individual with a disability is Uniquely Human by Barry Prezant. And it's very much kind of like a boots on the ground. Like he gives examples from his experience. He's a speech language pathologist. And it's very translatable, I feel like, into our context for like a faith setting, a church setting. And it is absolutely fantastic. It is one of the top like 3 books that I recommend reading. Another fantastic one, if you want to understand like the history and the cultural development of autism, is Neurotribes by Steve Silberman. It's a big book, but it's very helpful for understanding the development of our understanding of autism. And again, just like that kind of cultural, like, development of autism. For sensory processing disorder, a good book is The Out of Sync Child by Carol Stock Kranowitz. And all these are linked on the blog post, so you don't have to write this down. I'll put a link to the blog post up on the feed, and you can go and click through the links to get to some of these. In terms of some of the individual advocates I recommend starting with, I recommend looking up Amethyst Schaber. I'm probably mispronouncing her name. I apologize. She does a video series on YouTube called Ask an Autistic, and it's super informative, super engaging, and I highly recommend that. Go look up Dylan Barmash and hear what he has to say, particularly about like nonverbal autistics and their advocacy. Naoki Higashida. From the deaf community, Niall DeMarco, he's like a model, and I think he's doing a little bit of acting. He was on Dancing with the Stars, but he has his own foundation for really trying to promote language development for and access to signing and language for children within the deaf community. So he does some really informative videos. He tweets, he'll share on Facebook. Ricky Pointer, I think I'm pronouncing her last name right, I hope. She's another advocate from the deaf community. And again, I have actual links to like their websites or whatever the resources that I think might be most helpful to start at on the blog post this week. Zach Anner, I've already told you about him for cerebral palsy. Molly Burke and Lucy Edwards are a couple of young women who, are just living their lives for the blind or visually impaired community, but they're also trying to teach and inform about what it's like to be blind or visually impaired. Lauren Potter is an actress with Down syndrome, and she does some advocacy. I don't know if you might have seen on Facebook or social media elsewhere this really funny but kind of on point commercial or PSA about the term special needs, particularly with like Down syndrome. And it's hilarious. If you haven't seen it, go look on it. Look for it on YouTube. It's like special needs, Down syndrome, And it's, she talks about like, it would be special if, we had to eat dinosaur eggs, or if we had to go grocery shopping in armor. And it's hilarious. So, but really on point. So, another advocate from the Down syndrome community, most recently his video's been going, the video that's been making the rounds on social media, he's been, I guess, tagged or labeled as Frank Stevens, and he's talking about his right to exist and how we need to cure Alzheimer's and not Down syndrome. But he also is an actor and like a Paralympic athlete, and an advocate, and he does some of his work under John Franklin Stevens. So on the blog post, I put links to kind of under both names, some of his work for you to check out. So again, just what is a cultural approach, why it's important, some resources for developing that, specific resources. Go back, watch this if you missed the first part. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments. Even if you're watching this after the fact, I will come back and answer your questions. Like us on Facebook if you don't already, so that you can be notified when we do these Facebook Lives, or, we try to post a lot of really helpful content. Especially from that third source that we talked about, the disability community, to help with building that cultural understanding. We try to post a lot of that stuff. And we try to do helpful videos where they're like pre-recorded and edited, or these Facebook Lives, at least once a week is what we're trying to do. Typically it's probably going to be on like Thursdays, maybe Wednesdays, but basically the later half of the week. You can also follow us on Instagram at Uniquely Catholic. We share photos, we share thoughts, ideas, inspiration, blog posts. Sometimes we tweet. Our Twitter handle is at Uniquely Cath, because the Olic part, Catholic, was too long for Twitter. So you can also check us out over there. We don't tweet quite as much. So Instagram and Facebook are definitely the two best places to see us. Our website, again, is uniquelycatholic.org. We do weekly blog posts about disability integration, usually every Tuesday. We try for the morning. Sometimes it doesn't get out till the afternoon, but usually every Tuesday is when we have a new post up. You can also email us at uniquelycatholic.org@gmail.com. If you want training for your parish, you want someone to walk you through an integration pastoral plan, etc., just email us, uniquelycatholic.org@gmail.com. Contact us on our website, uniquelycatholic.org, on the Contact Us page, or you can message us on Facebook. And we are happy to do that. So thank you guys for joining. Again, if you have questions, leave comments. This cultural approach really is the foundation for disability integration. If we're approaching things with a deficit mentality, we're going to end up with a checklist, we're going to end up with a program, and we're not going to be able to really engage people and engage the process of disability integration. And if you're not sure what I'm talking about, the difference between a program or ministry and a process, that was last week's video and last week's post, so go check that out, because it's very intimately related to what we're talking about today. And just know that like a checklist may or may not help. You're kind of, as the saying goes, throwing spaghetti on the wall to see what sticks, right? But if you take this cultural approach, you're really getting to know the people in front of you. And that's what we're called to do, regardless of a person's ability or disability or what their neurology is like, their physical capabilities, etc. Like, we're just called to love everybody, because everyone is, already a part of the body of Christ. They're already members, and we're not doing anything special or benevolent or good for us, pat on the back. We are just recognizing our brothers and sisters in Christ and doing it well. So thank you again so much. If you enjoyed this video, like, love, share with other people, share with people from your parish, like us on Facebook. Let's stay in touch, and we'll talk to you guys soon. Thank you guys so much. Have a great day. God bless. Happy Advent this Sunday. New Year for us. So have a great Advent.